already mentioned, psychology is nothing but scientific method, right? Except if you're Freud. But no, it has to involve the scientific method, or it's not a science. So let's talk about it. 4 basic goals of psychology: describe, explain, predict, or control or influence behavior and mental processes. So that's what we kind of do. That's what we do in psychology. We try to do these things: describe something, explain something, predict the behavior that's going to come from something, control or influence behavior and mental processes. That sounds like an experiment, doesn't it? So let's look through this. We're going to look at stress, okay? And then we're going to look at how different psychologists might do these things, or might look at stress through either 1, 2, 3, or 4. So, describe using stress. So let's say that Dr. John is the psychologist. Trying to objectively describe the experience and effects of stress, Dr. John studies the sequence of responses that occur during stressful experiences, looking for patterns in thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Okay, so that's just describing. Explain. Seeking to explain the nature of stressful experiences, Dr. Brown studies how thoughts about stressful events evoke unpleasant emotions and physical changes. So that right there is explaining something. Explaining why stressful events evoke unpleasant emotional and physical changes. Then, predict, right? That's a psychologist might try to predict. So, Dr. House investigates responses to different kinds of challenging events, hoping to be able to predict the kinds of events that are most likely to evoke a stress response in the future. Dr. House, tonight, 9 o'clock on Fox. I couldn't stand that show. He was a little bit too negative for me. Control or influence. Dr. Love, after studying the effectiveness of different coping strategies to better control their reactions to stressful events. Control or influence. Studies the effectiveness of different coping strategies to be able to handle stressful events. So that's just an example of how you would look at something kind of differently, 4 different ways that a psychologist would look at a problem, which would be stress. All right. Critical thinking, I hope you know what it is, and I hope you are a critical thinker. So, the active process of minimizing the influence of preconceptions and biases while evaluating evidence, so knowing that those things exist, right, your preconceived notions, and not allowing them to influence you in some sort of way. Determining the conclusions that can reasonably be drawn from the evidence. Evidence? Okay. I can conclude that the evidence says this. That's what a critical thinker might do. And then considering alternative explanations for research findings or other phenomena. To be open-minded. Okay? The critical thinker is flexible, yet maintains an attitude of healthy skepticism. I love that. Okay? Open-minded, flexible, but maintains an attitude of healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism just means, I don't know about that, until you find some sort of evidence that helps you understand that, okay, that's the way it is. The critical thinker scrutinizes the evidence before drawing conclusions. The critical thinker can assume other perspectives. The critical thinker is aware of biases and assumptions. The critical thinker engages in reflective thinking. How did we come to this point? That's what a critical thinker does. The scientific method, I hope I don't need to explain this like legitly for anybody here, because you've hopefully been in education since you were 5 years old and you've been exposed to the scientific method. It's a little bit different here. We're not going to go crazy in depth to it. And some of the terms, like procedures, we're going to call that something else, operational definitions. So empirical evidence, verifiable evidence that is based upon objective observation, measurement, and or experimentation. Empiricism is taking things in, okay, so taking information in through the five senses. That's what empiricism is, empirical evidence. The scientific method, set of assumptions, attitudes, and procedures that guide researchers in creating questions to investigate, in generating evidence, and then drawing conclusions. Scientifically, scientific method. Formulate a testable hypothesis, right? Design the study and collect the data. Analyze the data and draw conclusions and then report the findings. That is the process by which we will use the scientific method in psychology. So the hypothesis, what is it? You know what it is, right? But our definition is going to be a tentative statement about the relationship between two or more variables, a testable prediction, or question. Here's an example. Psychological stress increases the likelihood of physical illness. There's a hypothesis. Imagine what you would do to possibly find the answer out to this question. Maybe you survey people over a period of time, right? And these people have already said that they are people who feel anxiety and are stressed out. And then you chart how many times they've been to the doctor and how many times they have actually been sick. And then you can possibly make a scatter plot, right? Point those things out on a graph. And then you create a correlational coefficient. And then you can understand and possibly find out some answers to your question. A variable is a factor that we can vary, that can vary, change in ways that can be observed, measured, and verified. We'll go over different types of those in a second. The operational definition is a precise description of how the variables in the study will be manipulated or measured. This is important because in psychology, we want to replicate experiments. We want to replicate research. The more we replicate research, the more concrete that research becomes, and we can understand humans and psychology a little bit better. Design the study and collect the data. So decide which research method to use for collecting data. There's two. Descriptive methods and experimental methods. Descriptive methods. Exactly what it says it is. Research strategies for observing and describing behavior. Identifying the factors that seem to be associated with a particular phenomenon. So you describe what's going on. Descriptive methods answer the who, what, where, and when kinds of questions about behavior. Who engages in a particular behavior? What factors or events seem to be associated with that behavior? Where does the behavior occur? When does the behavior occur? How often? That. Descriptive research. You would use that to answer those questions, right? Experimental methods. Hey, we're running experiments. Used to show that one variable causes the change in a second variable in an experiment. The researcher deliberately varies one factor, the independent variable, then measures the changes produced in a second factor, the dependent variable, right? Ideally, all experimental conditions are kept as constant as possible, but that's kind of hard to do because you can't think about you can't control everything, right? We'll talk about this here in a second. So, if changes occur in the second factor, those changes can be attributed to the variations from the first factor if everything is controlled appropriately. Analyze the data and draw conclusions. So we use statistics in psychology. Not a big math guy. That's why I teach social studies. I can barely count the papers that I can, pass out to certain rows. My mind just doesn't work like that anymore. Was I good at it in high school? Yeah, pretty good, but I'm out of practice. I don't do it very often. I love baseball though, and statistics, that is baseball. Okay, so this is a branch of mathematics used by researchers to organize, summarize, and interpret data to understand things, right? So researchers rely on statistics to determine whether the results support their hypothesis. They also use statistics to determine whether their findings are statistically significant. And if they are statistically significant, they didn't happen by chance. That's what that means. If something is statistically significant, it didn't happen by chance. Okay? So a statistical technique called meta-analysis is sometimes used in psychology to analyze the results of many research studies on a specific topic. So a meta-analysis is basically, you get to take all the research done on a specific thing, and then, or you want to know an answer. So you look at, you know, I have an example down here. Okay, meta-analysis. Study 1, Study 2, Study 3, Study 4. And this could be, the question could be, how does sleep affect the emotional brain, the amygdala? Study 1 was a sleep deprivation study. Study 2 was a survey done, you know, over people who felt like they were sleep deprived in their normal lives. Study 3 studied people with sleep apnea. Study 4 studied people with insomnia. And you take what these things find, right? And you take it, you take this study and this study and this study and this study, and you look at it through the lens of your question. Does sleep deprivation affect the emotional brain, the amygdala, and in what way? You're going to find some bits and pieces of information that are pretty important through those studies. If you pull them out, you might be able to answer your question by meta-analysis. And then there's report the findings. So, you know, psychological research is an interesting thing. You want to be published. You want to find something that nobody else has found before, right? And so for advances to be made in any scientific discipline, researchers must publish or share their findings with other scientists, and they usually do this in journals. So they describe the precise details of the study, and then other people get to replicate it, and that is so key. So report the findings and replicate. That's what it is. You want that to happen in psychology. If they start trying to replicate it and it doesn't replicate, guess what? Your research, thrown out the window. Building theories. You'll see a bunch of theories in psychology. We'll talk about theories of emotion here on the next slide. As research findings accumulate from individual studies, eventually theories develop. A model, a tentative explanation that tries to account for diverse findings on the same topic. Theories are not the same as a hypothesis, right? And theories aren't laws. In contrast, a theory integrates and summarizes numerous research findings and observations on a particular topic. Like any tool, the value of a theory is determined by its usefulness. Often, more than one theory proves to be useful in explaining a particular area of behavior. And that's the case with theories of emotion. So common sense tells us, I tremble because I feel afraid. And if you see up here, you see the dog, right? The conscious feeling, fear, and then the autonomic arousal, which could be screaming, right? That's what common sense tells us. The James Lange theory says, I feel afraid because I tremble. So here's the stimulus, barking dog, German Shepherd, which I love. Autonomic arousal, I'm screaming, and then the conscious feeling is fear. So I actually have to scream, my physical change has to happen first, and then I can understand that I'm scared. The Cannon-Bard theory is a little bit different. And these all are proven on different levels. And when we get to emotion, we'll talk about this. The Cannon-Bard, the dog makes me tremble and feel afraid at the same time. The stimulus, boom, barking dog. Subcortical brain activity, all right, conscious feeling of fear and the autonomic arousal happen at the exact same time. One doesn't precede the other. They actually exist together in the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. And then the Schachter two-factor theory, I like saying that. I label my trembling as fear because I appraise the situation as dangerous. Stimulus, barking dog, autonomic arousal, I'm screaming. Okay. Last time I was around a barking dog, this is the thinking that's going on right now with this woman. Last time I was around a barking dog, I almost got bit. Conscious feeling is now fear because I appraised the situation. So that's just an example of theories explaining one thing, emotional reaction. These are all proven on different levels, and we'll go over them when we come to emotion. But several theories can prove one thing, okay? Pseudoscience, fake science, false science. Pseudoscience, a theory, method, or practice that promotes claims in ways that appear to be scientific and plausible, even though supporting empirical evidence is lacking or non-existent. I'm not saying this stuff doesn't exist, but if you talk to a psychologist that's deep into psychology, they are going to say this stuff doesn't exist. Because they can't prove it. And remember, psychology is a scientific method thing. So, psychics, astrology / horoscopes. I think this right here cracks me up. I'm a Gemini, so Gemini, let me see what it says. Oh, the stars and planets will not affect your life in any way. And that actually happens to be the same thing for all of these. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm saying that in psychology, it's not proven through the scientific method, so they can't say it's true. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Carl Sagan, the original Neil deGrasse Tyson. Descriptive research methods. So let's go through a couple of ways that we can actually use descriptive research. We've talked about it already. Naturalistic observation, case studies, surveys, and correlational studies. So one by one, here we go. Naturalistic observation, the systematic observation and recording of behaviors as they occur in their natural setting. You're watching something without them knowing that you're watching. That's what naturalistic observation is. Can you learn a whole lot about how people or animals or organisms behave when they don't know you're watching them? Yeah. You might get a little peek on who they truly are, right? Researchers engaged in naturalistic observation try to avoid being detected, all right? Because what happens? You know, this happens in every day right now in our society. You know, you pull out a phone and you start recording somebody, you know, and they might change their behavior, right? Do it for the gram, right? It changes. When somebody knows that they're being watched, they aren't truly them. They might be overly concerned with the observation. The basic goal of naturalistic observation is to detect the behavior patterns that exist naturally. Patterns that might not be apparent in a laboratory, because again, you would be changed there because you'd be in a lab. You knew you were in a lab. One advantage of naturalistic observations is that it allows researchers to study human behaviors that cannot be ethically manipulated in an experiment. So there are certain laws, pretty much, that psychologists have to abide by when it comes to research. They have to stay within a certain ethical code. But you can get around that if you don't run the experiment and you just observe. So the only way really to do unethical things these days in psychology is to use naturalistic observation. Case studies are pretty simple. It's an intensive study of an individual or a small group of individuals. People known as case managers might be assigned to certain people, and they would do extensive interviews with that person and their family and their employer and whoever Possibly just to answer the questions of if this person is psychologically fit, if they have a disorder, the status of their mental health, in reference to probably give it to a psychologist so that they can end up helping that person reach their full potential or whatever. So a case study is just really specifically, intensely looking at an individual or a small group of people and taking extensive notes, all right? I mean, it's a vetting process. All right, surveys. Pretty simple. You know what a survey is. Back in the day when you walked through the mall, somebody would always hit you up with a survey. You mind completing the survey? About sea turtles? Yeah, we'll do it. Surveys are a pretty good way of collecting data. You know that. A questionnaire or interview designed to investigate the opinions, behaviors, and characteristics of a particular group. This is how they did the grant study. So whenever they did the grant study and studied the 260-some Harvard male students from the graduating classes of 1938 to 1940 over a long period of time called a longitudinal study. They used surveys. They used surveys to get the information from these people to find out what happiness and successfulness feels like over the lifespan. So one key advantage offered by survey research is that information can be gathered from a much larger group of people than other research methods. We have some terms down here. A sample is a selected segment of the population used to represent that group, or the group that is being studied. So it's just a sample, right? A representative sample is a selected segment that very closely parallels the larger population being studied on relevant characteristics. So representative sample would be picking, picking people to represent the whole, okay, of society possibly. Random selection is a process in which subjects are selected randomly from a larger group so that every group member has an equal chance of being included in the study. That's just randomly selecting and creating the group like that. These are some examples of surveys. You can check it out on your own time. Correlational studies, this is something you're going to have to pay attention right now to me about. So a research strategy that allows the precise calculation of how strongly related two factors are. A correlational coefficient is that number. So a numerical indication of the magnitude and direction of the relationship, the correlation between two variables. The correlational coefficient always happens between two numbers, -1 and +1, okay? The number and the sign. So the number indicates the strength of the relationship. The higher the number, the stronger the relationship is. Then the sign means something completely different. The sign indicates the direction